He never thought his grandfather's funeral would be the place he'd have to decide whether to marry a man he'd never met. Elijah Hart, 36, CEO of one of Silicon Valley's most promising tech firms, stood silently in the dark-paneled reading room of an old San Francisco law office. The fire had long died in the corner hearth, but the smell of aged wood and forgotten secrets clung to the walls like dust. In front of him sat a will yellowed, annotated, and held together by a single tarnished paperclip. It bore the signature of a man whose silence had shaped Elijah's entire childhood. The attorney adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. Hesitant like someone about to read a curse aloud, Elijah already knew the basics. His grandfather, Vincent Hart, had passed away just 2 weeks earlier after battling heart failure. Elijah had grown up believing the old man was distant, bitter, and obsessed with tradition. Now he realized he was also hiding something. The will was clear. Vincent's vast estate, including majority control of Hart Tech Industries, would not pass to Elijah unconditionally. The inheritance, as written, was to go to the man who once saved my life in the Ardennes, or the one who proves willing to stand beside him in name and in law. The room fell into a silence so complete Elijah could hear the ticking of the clock across the hall. The attorney elaborated there was no record of this man's name. No photograph, just a reference to a series of war journals, stored in a trunk in the attic of the Hart family estate. According to the will, if the man could be found alive, he must be recognized and honored. If not, Elijah could claim the inheritance, but only if he agreed to marry him, legally. Even if the union was symbolic, it sounded like a mistake, a loophole, a joke, but Vincent Hart had never joked in his life. Elijah wanted to laugh, but the room felt too heavy. There were already whispers in the company about the will. Some board members believed it was a publicity stunt. Others saw it as a disgrace. But the legalities were airtight. The company's bylaws had been quietly amended to reflect the stipulation 2 years prior. Vincent had planned this. For what purpose? Elijah still didn't know. It was then his father's sister. Monica, always first in line to criticize, slammed her palm against the table. "This is absurd. You're not seriously entertaining this." Elijah didn't respond. He wasn't sure what disturbed him more, the strange clause or the look in Monica's eyes. She wasn't just outraged, she was afraid, as if this clause threatened something more than inheritance. The rest of that day moved in static. Elijah barely remembered signing the first acknowledgments, but the thought lingered like smoke. Who was this unnamed soldier? Why had his grandfather built an empire only to leave it balanced on a wartime promise? That night, Elijah opened the war trunk. Inside were journals, dozens, with cracked leather covers and pages stained by time and moisture. Some entries were mundane rations, coordinates, casual observations of Europe blanketed in snow. Others veered into something else entirely, descriptions of a man with calm eyes and clever hands. He stitched the wound like he was sewing time shut. One line read, another entry simply said, "I wanted to tell him the truth that night, but the war was kinder than the country." Elijah read for hours, pausing only when he noticed the names had stopped appearing in the pages. From a certain point onward, the man was only referred to as you. He wondered why this person's name was never recorded. He wondered if his grandfather had been afraid. By morning, the journals had turned from war logs into a confession of memory and longing. There was no question anymore. This wasn't just about debt or duty. This was about love. And somewhere down, that man might still be alive, forgotten, discarded by a country that once demanded his silence. Elijah had made a life on logic, algorithms, predictability. But now he stood at the edge of something utterly human. He didn't know the man's face or name, but the stories, those quiet, trembling entries, had handed him a mission. Find the man who once saved his grandfather's life to me, and maybe had loved him. Marry him, if he still lived, not for the company, not even for the inheritance, but because some debts don't belong to banks or contracts. Some debts live in the hearts of the ones we've forgotten. And Elijah Hart, against every cold instinct he'd been raised with, knew he couldn't let that man be forgotten again. If you believe stories like this deserve to be told, stories of hidden love, quiet bravery, and second chances, don't forget to follow Heart Stories. Your support helps us keep these voices alive. The search didn't begin with certainty. It began with questions, in a city too large for answers. Elijah didn't go to his boardroom that morning. He didn't check his phone or respond to the growing number of emails titled inheritance concerns. Instead, he packed the leather journals into a messenger bag, pulled on the coat his grandfather had once worn to veterans' memorials, and walked out into a San Francisco still wet from last night's fog. The journals gave fragments, mentions of old barracks, a nickname Blue, a photo once taken near the Embarcadero before the soldiers shipped out. It wasn't much, but it was all he had. He started with veterans' shelters. Most were reluctant to talk, especially when a well-dressed stranger walked in asking about war stories. Some thought he was with the press. Others just stared through him, as if the weight of years made everything meaningless. 3 days passed. On the fourth, someone told him to go to the benches near Mission Creek Park. There's a man who sleeps there when the weather holds. Doesn't talk much. Carries a red scarf. One of ours. We think. Not confirmed. Elijah went at dawn. The streetlights were still on, flickering against the gray haze. And there, beneath an overpass, sat a figure. Older. Thin. Posture too straight for someone whose bones had surrendered to time. He wore layers of mismatched clothing, wool over denim, and a knit cap pulled low. On the bench beside him sat a battered duffel, and tied to its zipper a red scarf. Elijah approached slowly. The man didn't look up. He took a breath. I'm looking for someone. A veteran. He might have served with my grandfather. Vincent Hart, Ardennen, 1945. Silence. Then, a dry voice, hoarse but articulate. I served there. A lot of us did. Most of us didn't come back. Elijah nodded. He placed one of the journals on the bench. Opened to a page where a line was underlined twice, he gave me fire again. Not warmth, not hope, just fire. And I lived because of it. The man glanced at the page. His expression didn't change. What's your name? Elijah asked. The man didn't answer, but his eyes flicked to the edge of Elijah's bag. You read all of them, yeah, you believe them. I don't know what to believe, Elijah admitted. But I know he trusted someone, enough to put his legacy in their hands. A long pause. Then the man stood up slowly. His movements were deliberate, careful like someone used to cold mornings and colder memories. From inside his coat, he pulled out a small object wrapped in cloth. It was a silver lighter, engraved with initials, V, H, and R, D. Camp Lucky Strike, 1944. Your grandfather liked bourbon. Even in the trenches, the man said, voice lower now. I told him it was stupid. Said the Germans didn't care how well you'd toasted the night before. Elijah swallowed. Was your name? Richard, no, not anymore, the man said. I stopped using names a long time ago. Elijah didn't know what to say. The moment didn't call for sympathy or small talk. It asked for presence, quiet, respect. He watched the man place the lighter back into his coat, then gather his things. As he turned to leave, Elijah asked, would you come with me? The man stopped. Not far. Elijah continued. Just somewhere warm. I have more of the journals. And I think I'm the man your grandmother meant. I think, Elijah said carefully, you're the only one who hasn't turned away. The man looked at him for the first time then, really looked. Behind the lined skin and tired eyes was something still alert, still lit. I'm not a symbol, he said. I know. I'm not a headline or a key to your money. You're not? Then why? Elijah paused. Because someone wrote about you like you mattered more than anything else in the world. And I want to know who you are. A moment passed, then another, and finally the man nodded, just once. They walked together in silence, toward a small cafe just opening its doors to early risers and ghosts of wars no one wrote about. Elijah didn't know this man had saved his grandfather's life or merely shared it for a time. He didn't know if the will would accept this stranger as the one, but something deeper had begun. Not a transaction, not a rescue, just recognition. And for a man whose entire world was built on numbers and code, that somehow felt more human than anything he'd ever done. The ceremony took place on a Thursday. Rain had slicked the city streets, leaving reflections of blurred traffic lights and passing lives on the concrete. Inside a near-empty municipal courthouse, Elijah Hart signed his name on a marriage certificate beside a man listed only as Robert Danielson, a name he hadn't used in over 40 years. There were no vows, no guests, no photos, just two signatures, one legal witness, and a quiet nod between strangers bound not by affection, but by duty. Elijah didn't sleep that night. He sat by the window of his penthouse, watching the rain collect along the edge of the glass. The silence of his home had always soothed him until now. Something about the stillness felt like avoidance. He found himself replaying Robert's face over and over, unreadable, yet not empty, detached, yet still quietly present. By morning, the storm outside had moved into the headlines. Billionaire tech heir marries homeless war veteran in secret ceremony, scandal or strategy. Hart Tech CEO's shocking marriage raises questions. Inheritance games turn personal as Elijah Hart marries elderly stranger. Screens at elevators, news tickers in taxis, even shareholder memos, all pulsing with one question: why the company's board of directors scheduled an emergency vote. Stock prices trembled. The family estate's legal advisor sent Elijah a long email packed with warnings: rescind, clarify, deny. But Elijah said nothing, not publicly. Behind closed doors, the opposition had to face Monica Hart, his father's sister, always proper, always sharp, always watching from the corners of every room. Now she stood at the front of the boardroom with a press statement in her hand and fire behind her eyes. This man, this veteran, if he is even who he says, has no identification, no military confirmation, no financial independence, and now he's married to our CEO. What are we telling the world? Elijah stood calmly. We're telling them the truth, which is that sometimes the people we forget are the ones who carry the most weight. And I'm not going to be the kind of heir who pretends they didn't exist. The board murmured. Monica's lips tightened. You're risking billions. I'm honoring the only man my grandfather ever trusted without conditions. The meeting ended without resolution, but the pressure outside only intensified. Robert, now staying in a modest guest room down the hall from Elijah's study, remained silent on the matter. He spent his hours reading books Elijah had never touched, walking with quiet steps as if afraid to leave footprints. He refused all media requests, declined interviews, and barely spoke during meals. But he didn't hide. He sat in the living room when Elijah returned from chaotic board sessions. He offered a single cup of coffee on mornings Elijah looked particularly worn. And once, when Elijah asked why he never corrected anyone about the marriage, Robert answered without looking up from his book, I've already spent my life correcting what people think I am. It didn't work. Maybe this time, silence will say more. Still, Elijah wondered what had Robert lost over the years. What bridges had burned behind him to lead to that bench under the bridge? What faces had disappeared late one night? Elijah brought down another journal, one with a torn leather binding and brittle pages. He handed it to Robert, wordlessly. It was dated January 12, 1945. The handwriting was fast, emotional. Vincent's entries bled ink and urgency. That day, he had been wounded. That day, someone dragged him from the snow. The last lines read, he held me with one hand and covered the wound with the other. I wanted to tell him the truth that I couldn't breathe because of him, not the blood, but I swallowed it because the war was kinder than the world. Robert read in silence. His fingers trembled only once. The next day, Elijah found a box outside his study. Inside the silver lighter, the red scarf and a photo faded, cracked but unmistakable, two soldiers leaning into one another, not quite touching. The war behind them, and something fragile between them. Elijah stared at it for a long time. Later that week, a low-profile but influential news blog released an article. Its title, "The Man Behind the Marriage Who is Robert Danielson, and Why His Silence Speaks Louder Than the Hart Legacy." It was unexpectedly gentle, humanizing. It reframed the story not as a scandal, but as a reckoning. A man honoring a buried history, a corporation being pulled back to its moral spine. The storm, for now, began to settle. But something had shifted in Elijah, not just in how the world saw him, but in how he had begun to see the man who shared his name on paper. What had started as a strategy was now a question, not of inheritance, but of identity, and perhaps of debt. One not paid in dollars, but in dignity. Elijah didn't plan to open the trunk again, not after the first time, not after everything that had followed. But something about the way Robert had placed the lighter, scarf, and photo on his desk quiet, deliberate. Like closing a chapter felt incomplete, as if he were offering an ending Elijah wasn't ready to accept. That night, Elijah returned to the Hart family estate for the first time in months. Alone, he climbed into the attic, flashlight in hand, stepping carefully across beams dusted in decades. The old war chest was still there, tucked beneath a faded American flag and a photograph of Vincent Hart in uniform. This time, Elijah lifted every item out, one by one. Beneath the final row of journals was a hidden envelope, its edges brittle, sealed in wax. He broke the seal. Inside was a bundle of letters, not entries, letters, addressed only to R, dated from 1946 to 1952. They had never been sent. The handwriting was tense, conflicted, grieving and hopeful in the same breath. They told me to marry Evelyn, that people were starting to ask questions. I said yes before I could say no. I'm sorry. I still hear your laugh. It echoes louder than the parades. If you ever read this, I want you to know what we had was real, even if the world refused to call it by name. Elijah read until sunrise. He didn't cry, but his chest felt hollow by the end. His grandfather, the man who'd built a technological empire with unshakable logic, had lived half a life in silence. That silence had cost someone else everything. He returned to the city and found Robert standing at the window, watching the clouds over the bay. Without a word, Elijah placed the letters on the table between them. Robert stared, unmoving, before sitting down slowly. He read the first, then the second. By the fourth, he had to remove his glasses and press the heel of his hand into his eyes. "This isn't pity," Elijah said softly. "It's truth, and the truth doesn't expire." Robert folded the letters, one by one, like something sacred. "We were careful," he murmured. "Careful enough to be invisible. And even that wasn't safe." For a long time, neither of them spoke. Later that week, Elijah made a decision, one that would no longer center the board, the family, or even himself. He would tell the story. He contacted a journalist not from a tabloid or corporate affiliate, but an independent voice he trusted, someone who valued history more than headlines. He provided excerpts of the journals and letters. He told them about the will, the inheritance clause, the symbolic marriage. But most of all, he told them about Vincent and Robert, not as relics of a different time, but as two young soldiers who had dared to care for each other in a world that refused to let them. The article went live within the week. "The Man My Grandfather Loved, A Hidden History of Hart-Tech's Founder and the Soldier Who Saved His Life." It spread quickly, but unlike the initial media frenzy, this time the tone was different. Messages flooded in, not of outrage, but of resonance. Men in their 70s and 80s wrote comments like, "This could have been us." Younger viewers shared the story with hashtags like #SilentBravery and #HeartTruth. And then, something unexpected happened. Veterans groups began reaching out, not just for publicity, but for acknowledgement. One organization requested permission to include the letters in a public archive. Another offered Robert an honorary medal, retroactive for service and sacrifice never recognized. Meanwhile, Monica Hart fell quiet. Publicly, Internally, she sent an email to the board stating she would temporarily step down for personal reasons. Elijah didn't respond. He had no interest in revenge, only restoration. A week later, Hart Tech hosted its annual innovation conference. Instead of unveiling a new product, Elijah took the stage to tell the story of two soldiers. He didn't use slides. He didn't rehearse a speech. He simply read one of the letters out loud, in full. The final paragraph. If legacy means anything, let mine be this, that someone, someday, will have the freedom to hold the person they love without fear. And if I cannot have that in life, maybe I can leave behind a world that makes it possible for someone else. When he finished, the room stood in silence. Then, one by one, they applauded, not for performance, but for truth. Backstage, Robert sat alone, hands folded in his lap. Elijah walked towards him, unsure if he should say anything, but Robert stood first. And for the first time since they'd met, he reached out not to hand something over, not to return an object, but simply to hold Elijah's hand. No words, just presence. And perhaps, finally, peace. Winter came early that year. The air over the bay turned sharp and colorless, carrying the weight of something ending. Robert's health had declined slowly, nothing sudden, nothing dramatic. Just quiet shifts, fatigue where there used to be stillness, more time spent near windows, fewer words over breakfast. Elijah noticed but didn't press. There was a grace in how Robert allowed the silence to speak, and Elijah had learned to listen. The diagnosis came gently. Stage 4 lung cancer, likely dormant for years. The doctors were kind, but clear. A few months, perhaps less. Robert nodded. Elijah didn't. They didn't make announcements. There were no fundraisers, no interviews, no pity campaigns. Instead, they made space. Robert asked to return once to the old Hart estate, just for an afternoon. Elijah drove him. They walked slowly through the overgrown garden paths, past stone benches and broken sundials. Robert paused beneath an elm tree near the edge of the property, the same one where, decades ago, Vincent had carved a mark too shallow to survive time. But Robert remembered. He placed his hand on the bark, not to find the scar, but to feel what remained. Weeks passed. On a gray morning in December, Robert passed away in his sleep. He left no final letter, no speech, only a folded napkin with a note Elijah found beside the coffee maker. Thank you for not letting me be erased. Elijah arranged the funeral himself. No press, no cameras, just a handful of names from the Veterans Center, a few board members who had learned to stay quiet, and one elderly man who walked with a cane and refused to say how he knew Robert, only that he'd once shared a foxhole and a flask. The headstone was simple. Robert Danielson, 1925-2023. He lived, he loved, and he stayed. Elijah had the grave placed next to Vincent's. It hadn't been easy. The family estate cemetery hadn't seen a new burial in 20 years. And there were objections. He overruled them. Then he did something else. He returned to the annual Hart Tech stage, not as CEO, not as a product visionary, but as a grandson and a husband. He told them about Robert, not the war hero, not the controversy, but the man who read Steinbeck, who took his coffee black, who once knew love before the world had a name for it. He ended the talk with a line from one of Vincent's unsent letters. We were brave in war, but we weren't brave enough to say we were in love. Forgive me for asking the world to remember everything except you. And then Elijah looked out over the room, not just at executives or shareholders, but at people with pasts they never told, or loves they never named. I won't ask you to remember Robert because of who he was to me. I'll ask you to remember him because he was never supposed to be remembered at all. And maybe that's why it matters. Later that year, he launched the Legacy and Light Foundation, dedicating half of his inheritance to preserving untold queer histories in military archives, housing programs for aging LGBTQ+ veterans, and a scholarship for students pursuing oral history documentation. The Hart Tech board called it unconventional. Elijah didn't care. He kept the scarf, he kept the lighter, But the photo, the one with two soldiers not quite touching, he gave to the Smithsonian. Let the country remember what it once demanded be forgotten. Now, every winter, Elijah returns to that elm tree. He brings 2 cups of black coffee, leaves one on the bench, and sits with the other. Not in mourning, but in thanks. If someone loved quietly for you to live loudly, would you honor them the way they never could themselves? Tell us below who you think deserves to be remembered. And if you believe stories like this should never fade, follow Hart Stories. We're here to speak the names time tried to erase.